When winter arrived in medieval Europe, life for peasants became quiet, slow, and difficult. The land that had once been green with crops turned hard, frozen, and empty. Snow often covered the fields, and the air stayed cold for many weeks at a time. For the peasants, survival meant careful preparation, patience, and endurance. Peasants were not wealthy. They did not have large stores of gold or fine clothing to protect them. Instead, they relied on what they had grown, what they had stored, and what they could make with their own hands. The success of winter survival depended on how well the autumn harvest had gone and whether food had been stored properly. Food was a central concern. During the summer and autumn, peasants worked hard to gather grains like wheat, rye, oats, and barley. These grains were threshed, dried, and stored in sacks or wooden bins. They were kept in barns, cellars, or sometimes in small granaries raised above the ground to protect them from rats and dampness. Bread made from these grains would be the main food through the long, cold months. Vegetables were also stored. Peasants grew onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips. Root vegetables were buried in the ground or stored in cool cellars where they could last for many weeks. Cabbage was often salted or pickled, which gave it a sour taste but allowed it to remain edible during winter. These foods were not exciting, but they were reliable. Meat was less common because most animals had to be kept alive for farming. Cows gave milk, chickens laid eggs, and sheep provided wool. But some animals, especially pigs, were slaughtered in late autumn before winter began. The meat was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. Salt pork, bacon, or smoked fish could be eaten in small amounts with bread or stew. It was never enough for luxury, but it added strength to the plain meals. The main dish of winter was often a thick pottage. This was a simple stew made from whatever could be found: grains boiled in water, bits of meat or fish if available, onions, herbs, and vegetables. The pottage simmered slowly over the hearth fire, warming the home and filling the air with a mild smell. It was not rich or sweet, but it kept people alive. Fire was another concern. In villages, peasants gathered wood during autumn to prepare for the cold season. Logs were stacked carefully so they could dry. In some places, peat was cut from marshy land and dried into blocks that burned slowly. A steady fire in the hearth was important not only for warmth, but also for cooking food. Without firewood, survival would be much harder. Clothing was simple but practical. Wool was the most common material, spun and woven from the sheep kept in the village. Wool garments were thick and warm, though sometimes itchy. Peasants wore tunics, cloaks, and hoods. Layers were important, and clothing was often patched and repaired over many years. In very cold places, fur from rabbits or sheep might be added for extra warmth. The homes of peasants were small and made of wood, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs. Inside, the hearth fire gave some warmth, but much heat was lost through the walls and roof. To stay warmer, people and animals sometimes shared space. Cows, goats, or pigs might be kept in part of the house or in an attached barn, and their body heat added warmth to the living area. Families huddled together at night, sharing blankets or sleeping on straw beds covered with cloth. Daily life slowed down. With the fields frozen, there was little farming to do. Instead, peasants repaired tools, mended clothes, or made simple items from wood or leather. Women spun wool and made yarn. Children helped gather water, feed animals, or collect firewood. The days were short and much time was spent indoors sitting by the firelight. Religious life also continued. The winter season included important holy days like Christmas and the Feast of Epiphany. The church was a central part of village life, and the celebration of these days gave peasants moments of joy and community. Even in the darkest days of winter, festivals reminded them that spring would return. The biggest challenge was always scarcity. If the harvest had been poor, or if food ran out too quickly, hunger became severe. Some peasants stretched food by eating thin porridge, adding more water and less grain. Others gathered wild foods from the forest, such as nuts, berries left from autumn, or edible roots. In times of great difficulty, starvation was a real danger. Yet peasants were resilient. They knew the cycles of the year and how to endure them. Winter was never easy, but through simple meals, careful storage, warm clothing, and shared effort, they survived until spring brought new life to the land. The village landscape in winter was quiet. Snow covered the fields and the roads were frozen and still. Small cottages stood close together, smoke rising slowly from the chimneys into the cold air. The sound of animals was muffled, and the daily bustle of farming was replaced with silence. Life seemed slower, as if the world itself had fallen asleep. Inside the cottage, the hearth fire was the heart of the home. The flames were small but steady, and people gathered close to feel its warmth. Cooking pots hung over the fire, giving off steam. Shadows flickered on the walls as the fire burned, and the crackling of wood was one of the few sounds of comfort. Food preparation was done carefully because supplies had to last. A woman might take dried beans, onions, and barley and place them in the pot with water. The mixture would cook slowly through the day. It was not a feast, but it filled the stomach and gave energy for the cold evenings. Every meal was simple, and every meal mattered. Children spent their time near the fire as well. They played with small wooden toys or helped their parents with chores. Sometimes they listened to stories told by elders, stories about saints, old kings, or village legends. These tales passed the time and gave warmth to the imagination, even as the air outside was frozen and still. Animals were important in winter. Cows, goats, and sheep gave milk, which could be made into butter or cheese. Chickens, if they survived the cold, still laid a few eggs. These small gifts of food were precious. Often animals were kept in a barn beside the cottage or even in a corner of the house so that their body heat helped to keep the family warm. Clothing was layered to hold in warmth. Men wore woolen tunics and cloaks fastened with simple wooden or metal pins. Women wore long woolen dresses with aprons and often wrapped themselves in shawls or hoods. Children wore smaller versions of the same garments, often made from leftover scraps of cloth. Nothing was wasted, and every patch of fabric had value. The short days and long nights changed the rhythm of life. Candles and oil lamps were rare and expensive, so most work ended when the sun went down. Families sat together in the dark, with only the firelight to see by. They talked quietly, sang simple songs, or prayed together before sleep. The quietness of the night gave rest, though the cold was never forgotten. Winter also meant maintenance. Tools that could not be used in the frozen fields were repaired indoors. Wooden handles were polished, iron blades were sharpened, and ropes were braided anew. A peasant's survival depended on these tools, and winter was the only time to prepare them for the busy months ahead. Wool spinning was another common task. Women and older children sat together, turning raw wool into yarn. The steady rhythm of spinning wheels or drop spindles filled the room with a soft, repetitive sound. Yarn would later be woven into cloth, which could be turned into clothing, blankets, or bags. This work, though quiet, gave a sense of progress during the long months. Peasants also made simple household items. Wooden spoons were carved, baskets were woven from reeds, and leather was stitched into small bags. These crafts were necessary, not decorative. Every object had a purpose, whether for carrying food, storing grain, or eating a meal. The long evenings gave time for hands to work steadily and patiently. The church was a center of life in every season, including winter. On Sundays and holy days, villagers walked slowly along frozen paths to the stone church at the heart of the village. Inside, the air was cold, but candles glowed faintly. Prayers and hymns echoed, reminding peasants that their struggle was shared and that hope and faith would carry them through the season. Sometimes the village came together for shared tasks. A pig slaughtered in autumn might be preserved in large amounts, requiring many hands. Salt was rubbed into the meat, smokehouses filled the air with a strong scent, and fat was rendered into lard for cooking. The work was tiring, but everyone benefited, for it meant more food through the winter. Illness was a constant worry during winter. Cold air, damp homes, and poor diets weakened the body. Coughs and fevers spread quickly in small cottages, where many people shared the same space. With no doctors nearby, peasants relied on herbal remedies passed down through generations. Garlic for strength, honey for sore throats, or teas made from dried herbs stored from the summer. Festivals broke the monotony. Christmas was a time of joy, even in poor homes. Families shared what they could, a slightly larger loaf of bread, a bit of meat, or spiced ale if available. Some villages sang carols or performed simple plays. These brief celebrations lifted spirits and reminded peasants that winter was not only about hardship, but also about togetherness. For children, winter was both difficult and playful. Though cold and hungry at times, they still found joy in the snow. They threw snow at one another, slid on frozen ponds, or chased each other between cottages. Laughter echoed across the village, a sound that softened the hard season. Even in poverty, children found ways to play. Hunger often returned near the end of winter. Grain supplies grew low, vegetables shriveled, and salted meat became scarce. Meals grew smaller, and people stretched what they had by adding more water to stews and eating more bread made with oats or barley. These lean months were remembered as the hungry gap, a time when every bite was precious. Despite hardships, winter also gave peasants rest from endless field labor. In warmer months, work began at sunrise and ended at sunset, leaving little time for anything but farming. Winter slowed life down. It was a season to mend, to wait, and to think. Even in hardship, some found peace in a slower rhythm. The bond between neighbors grew stronger in these times. Families shared food when they could, exchanged wool or tools, and helped one another with heavy tasks. Survival was not only individual but communal. A village that cooperated was far more likely to endure the cold than one that remained divided. Winter nights could feel endless. The sun set early, leaving many hours of darkness. Some families told stories, others prayed, and some simply sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire. The darkness outside seemed to press against the walls, but the small glow inside gave comfort. Each night endured was another step closer to spring. The landscape beyond the village was quiet and still. Forests stood bare, rivers froze, and fields rested under snow. Sometimes wolves were heard in the distance, their howls carried through the night air. While dangerous, they rarely approached unless hunger was great. Their presence reminded peasants of the wild world beyond the safety of their village. In all of this, faith was central. The rhythm of prayer, the cycle of church festivals, and the promise of spring carried people forward. Winter was not only physical survival, but also spiritual endurance. Belief in a better season ahead gave peasants strength to carry on through the bitter cold. As winter slowly drew to its end, signs of change appeared in small and quiet ways. Icicles melted from the edges of cottages, dripping water into the soil. The snow began to soften, and patches of brown earth showed beneath. Birds returned, their songs faint but welcome after months of silence. These simple signs gave peasants hope. Food stores by this time were often at their lowest. Empty sacks, bare shelves, and dwindling supplies reminded families how fragile survival could be. Every remaining onion, every handful of grain, every crumb of bread was counted carefully. The hungry gap tested patience and endurance more than any other part of the year. Spring, however, always promised renewal. As the soil thawed, plows were taken from their storage. Oxen were harnessed once again, and peasants walked into the open fields with hope and determination. Seeds that had been saved from the previous harvest were placed gently into the ground. Each seed was a chance for survival, a step toward another year of life. The return of work also brought energy back to the village. Men tilled the fields, women tended the gardens, and children helped with small chores outdoors. The village, silent in winter, became lively again. The sound of tools striking earth replaced the quiet of snow, and the smell of fresh soil filled the air. Though winter had been long, its lessons were familiar. Preparation, patience, and cooperation carried peasants through each cold season. The cycle repeated year after year, and though hardships never vanished, resilience grew stronger with every survival. Life was never easy, but it was steady, tied to the earth and its unchanging rhythm. And so, through long nights, meager meals, and silent days, medieval peasants endured the winter. They waited, they worked, and they hoped. When the first green shoots rose from the soil, it was a reminder that life always returned, and that survival through hardship brought renewal. The cold would come again, but so too would the spring.